Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to look at navigating between screens in a NativeScript Angular 2 application. So what this means is we're actually going to be using a lot of Angular 2 code to make this possible, more specifically the Angular 2 router. Now it's important to note going into this that this tutorial uses the stable release of Angular 2. This is not using any of the release candidates or any of the betas because everything has changed since then. So this is the stable release. This is the real deal. So our goal here is we're going to create an application we can navigate between two different screens, passing data between the two screens, things like that. So to make this tutorial as easy as possible to follow, we're going to start off with a fresh NativeScript application. So you can see I do have my terminal open. For reference, we're going to be using NativeScript 2.3.1. That's the version that I'm using. It'll probably be very similar, if not the same, for future versions, at least for the Angular 2 release. But that's what my version is, so that way you know. So let's go ahead and on our desktop create a new project. I'm going to call it TNS create my project --ng. The --ng will create us an Angular 2 project. With the project created, go ahead and navigate into it. And we're going to add our build platforms. So for this particular demo, I'm only going to be adding the iOS build platform, but this tutorial will work for Android and iOS. So if you're using a Linux or Windows machine, you'll be using Android. If you're using a Mac, you can do iOS or Android or both. It's up to you. So I'm going to add my iOS platform. Perfect. So let me clear my terminal. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up my project using my editor of choice, being Atom. You can go ahead and open up the project however you'd like. All right, so with the project open, let me close these tabs so we can start from fresh. With the project open, we're going to be spending all of our time in the app directory inside of our project. What we're actually going to do is we're going to create several new pages. We're not going to really worry about the stock app component.html and the stock app.component.ts file. But what we are going to do just to clean things up just a little bit is we're going to delete whatever's in the CSS file. I'm personally not a fan as of right now of what the default is for the CSS, but it doesn't hurt either way. It's just preference for now, as CSS really won't be the topic of this particular tutorial. All right, so the first thing we want to do is create two new directories inside of the app directory. Well, more specifically, we're going to create a directory called components. So inside of our app directory, we have components, and then we're going to create two more directories. We're going to create a page 1, and we're going to create a page 2. All right. Inside of each of these directories, we need to create two files. So we're going to create a file called page1.ts. And we're going to create a file called page1.html. And then we're going to do pretty much the same thing for page 2. So page2.html and page2.ts. Perfect. Because I'm a little lazy, what we're going to do is we're going to copy some of this code. We're going to go into our app.component.ts file. We're going to copy all of it, and we're going to paste it into the two new TypeScript files. And we're going to edit it in just a second. So for example, page2.ts, we're going to change the selector to read page 2. The template URL is going to read page2.html. And we're going to delete what's the default inside of the app component class. But we're actually going to rename that class as well because it already exists. So this one's actually going to be called page 2 component. All right, so let's go ahead and hop over to page1.ts. We're going to do the same thing. Let's wipe out what's there. Let's call this page 1. Change the selector We're going to change app component to page 1, and then that should be good for now. So we have our 2 pages hooked up to their corresponding HTML file, and all is good as of now. So we are going to open up the, well, we don't need to open up the app component.html. Our UI is going to be very basic. So for example, inside of page 1, let's go ahead and create an action bar. This is page1.html. It's going to have a title of page 1. Very simple. And then it's going to have a stack layout. For simplicity, we're going to copy this and paste it into page2.html. And we're just going to change the title to page 2. So we're getting closer. So now what we actually need to do is we need to worry about linking up these pages, or at least for now, linking up the first page. But we're actually going to do this all in one. So it's going to be one smooth move here. We're going to create a file in the app folder, so not the components folder. In the app folder, we're going to create a file and we're going to call it app.routing.ts. In reality, it could be whatever you want to name it, but for us, we're going to keep it simple and call it that. So inside of this file, this is where we're going to link up all of our possible navigation destinations. So for example, let's go ahead and import page 1, from, and this will be components / page 1 / page 1. And we're going to do the same thing for page 2. So page 2 and page 2. All right. So as you can see, this app.routing file was created at the base layer, the app layer. It does look like there's an error here. So import page 1, it says no exported member page 1. So that's because it's actually called page 1 component. Perfect. All right, so now that we have the 2 components imported, now what we want to do is we want to create a set of possible routes. So these routes will contain a path and then the component that is linked to that path. So what we're going to say is export const for constant. We're going to say app routes. The type is going to be any, but in reality it's the Angular 2 router if you want to use that instead. But we're just going to call it any, and it's going to be an array of possible route combinations. So for example, the first route, we're going to have a path, and that path is going to be empty. The empty path means it's a default path. It'll be the screen that appears when you launch your application. So we're going to use the empty path, and it's going to be linked up to the component page 1 component. And we're going to do the same thing for the second one, but this time for the path, we're going to say page 2. Perfect. So we do now have our possible routes, the 2 routes, and you would add as many as you want in there. The next up, let me put a semicolon on that. The next up, what we want to do is we want to export all of our components so that way we can include them all in one without having to do them one by one. So to do this, it'll make sense when I show you, but to do this, we'd say export const app components. It's going to be of type any equals an array, and that array is going to have page 1 component and page 2 component. All right, so if you've been following along with Angular 2 up until now, up until the stable release, you'll know this is pretty different from what we started with. But if you're new to Angular 2, new to NativeScript, this will be the first time you're seeing it, and that's all right because it's really not too difficult either way. So we do have all of our routes defined. Our routing is good to go. What we need to do now is we really need to link it up into our main file, our main.ts file. And inside of this main.ts file, you'll notice this ng module. This is where we're going to add this app.routing.ts information. So what we need to do is we need to import app routing TS. So import, and we're going to import app components and app routes from, and this is going to be from app.routing. Well, we don't need the TS. So we're going to save it. And what we're going to do is inside of the declarations, this is where that array of components makes sense. So instead of adding a one by one, we can actually use ... and then app components. So it'll actually expand that array and fill it into the declarations. Otherwise, I mean, we could import page 1 component, page 2 component inside of this main.ts file and add them one by one into this array. Not very efficient. So it's much easier to use the ... We're not done though. We need to add something to our imports, but not yet. So we need to import another item. We need to say import, and we need to say NativeScript router module from NativeScript Angular router. And it seems I have some kind of issue somewhere. Nope, it was just my editor being slow. All right, so in the imports, let me clean this up a bit where we have NativeScript module. We're going to add a few more here. So we have NativeScript module. Now we need to have NativeScript router module. But we also need to do NativeScript router module dot for root, and then this is where we pass in the app routes. Oh, no semicolon there. My mistake. All right, so far so good. Now what we need to worry about is actually establishing the actual navigation. So everything is bootstrapped and in place as of now, but it doesn't really do anything. So if I were to open up my file, or my simulator, it probably wouldn't do anything right now. We need to go to app component.html, and we need to make a slight change. Well, actually, we're actually not going to use app component.html. We're going to use app component.ts. We're going to eliminate all of this because it's not needed. We are going to change template URL into something else. We're going to change template URL into template, and we're going to pass in some HTML tags. So we're going to say page router outlet, page router outlet. So what this means is any one of our routes is going to pass through this tag. So this app component.ts file is going to act as our driver for all of our routes. If we wanted to, we could add some templating code around it, but we don't need that for now. So if I go to my terminal here, let's try to run this and see what happens. So TNS emulate iOS. All right, so there was an error, so I may have a mistake somewhere. Let's check it out. So it says page does not exist. Our page dot. All right, so let's go ahead and look in our page1.ts file. And what we want to do is we probably want to say, well, at least let's try it. Let's say components/page1 and see if that makes a difference. Sometimes the paths throw me off. It's normal. It'll probably happen to everyone at least once. All right, so it errored. It looks like it got further this time, so it was the issue. I had the wrong path. So let me do the same thing for the page2.typescript file. So it wants to be at components, page 2. So yeah, just make sure your paths are correct. But like I said, it'll probably happen. It could happen to anyone. Oh, and it's still going to error because I don't think dot components is going to be a good one. Yeah, let me try it again. All right, so it worked this time. So yeah, definitely user error will get the best of you pretty much every time. And it happens to everyone, doesn't matter how skillful you are. You could always make a mistake. All right, so we do have page one. All we have again is our action bar with a stack layout with nothing in it. What we want to be able to do is what we're going to add is we're going to add a button to the action bar, and this will navigate us to the next page. So if we go to page1.html, oh, that's not the HTML file. If we go to page1.html, let's go ahead and say, we don't need anything inside of the stack layout, but let's say inside of our action bar, we're going to say action item. And we're going to say for text equals next. And let's say for the iOS position, it's going to be on the right side of the action bar. And I don't have any kind of tap events yet because I don't have anything in the TS file. So what we want to do is we can say in here inside of page1.ts, let's go ahead and say on tap. And the on tap function is going to say navigate us somewhere, but in order to navigate us somewhere we need to import the router. So we're going to say import router from Angular/router. So with the router imported, what we can do is first of all we need to inject it with our constructor. So public constructor, and inside the constructor we'll say private router. This way, so inside of our tap, we can say this.router.navigate, and where we want to navigate to, I believe we called it page 2. So this is the value that we added to our app.routing file. So this is the path, so page 2, and that's inside of our on tap here. So I'll put a semicolon, and we'll go into our HTML, and inside of our HTML we'll say tap, and we'll say on tap. So it'll trigger this method when we tap it. So in theory, up until now, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use live sync this time. It should work out for us. Is we're going to test it and we're going to see that navigation happen. So we're saying TNS live sync iOS -- emulator -- y. All right, so we do now have a button now that the application has started again. This button says next, which is what we called it. It's on the right hand side, so if I click it, hopefully it should navigate us to the next page. And it did. So it navigated us to the next page, and by default it put a button on the left hand side. We can actually change that, but let's hit back, and it navigated us back. All right, so now we're going to work on a few more things just to get all of this navigation stuff off our chest. So what we want to do now is we want to change that back button. We want to call it, let's just call it back. So in page 2, for our action bar, what we're actually going to say is it's called a navigation button. And the text is going to say back. Hit save. I believe I am using live sync. So it already pushed the changes, hit next, and now it says back instead of page 1. So you can make it a little more pleasant if you want. It's definitely a good way to do things. Now what we want to do is we want to pass information into the next screen. So we want to pass in maybe an ID so that way we can do a lookup on the next screen. Who knows, whatever the scenario is. So let's go into our page 1, and we're going to go into our router navigate, and we want to pass in a string variable. So it could be more complex if you wanted to, but we're going to start easy with strings, string parameters. and save everything else for a more complicated tutorial. So for example, we're going to just pass in a hard-coded value. I'm going to call it Nick Raboy. Usually I find myself passing in an ID or something so that way I can query it on the next page. But we're just going to use my name, so just a string. So to make this possible, what we need to do now is we need to jump over to the approuting.ts file. So as of right now, our second page, page 2, this route doesn't expect any information to come with it. So we need to add a possible parameter to be added with it. So let's go ahead and do /:, and then let's just call it name, because that's what I'm passing. That's what I'm calling that particular parameter. So I just saved it. This is app.routing.ts, add :name. So if I jump into now page 2, I can go ahead and retrieve that value. But there's some foundation that needs to be laid first in order to make this possible. So we're actually going to import activated route from Angular router, and then we need to inject it. So we need to say public constructor private route activated route, and then we can subscribe to any kind of parameters that come in when our constructor fires. So let's say this dot route dot params dot subscribe params. That's going to be what's passed in, and then we can retrieve whatever parameters were passed in there. So let's go ahead and say we're going to create a value. This value is going to be public. Let's call it name. Let's call it full name. This will be a string. And then inside of this, we can say this dot full name equals params name. Name being what we called it inside of app.routing.ts. So it'd probably be a good idea to print out what we have just retrieved from our previous page. So if we open up page2.html, let's go ahead and add a label. So we're going to say label text equals hello, and then we called it full name, right? And that's going to be all that exists in page 2. So in theory, it should present hello, Nick Raboy. So I'm going to open up my terminal, which I believe I'm still live reloading. I'm going to click next. And you can see it says hello, Nick Raboy. So we passed that value in from the first page. So that's, again, incredibly convenient. You're going to find yourself using it all the time. So that's just the basics when it comes to navigation in a Angular 2 NativeScript application. So just to recap, because we did quite a bit. So first of all, we created 2 pages, page 1 and page 2, both of which that have a TypeScript and an HTML file. We created an app.routing file, which could be named whatever you want as long as you remember the name, where we actually defined our routes and the possible components for those routes. We hopped back to main.ts, where we injected the particular components inside of the declarations, and then we added the possible routes to the imports. What we also did is inside of page 1, we defined that when the tap event is fired, when this function is fired, we're going to navigate to page 2, which was defined in app routing. We're going to pass in this string and receive it in page2.ts using the subscribe, at which point we actually presented that on the screen. So we did a whole lot. There's a whole lot more that you can do. You could set up page transitions. You could receive more complicated data. You can navigate in various other ways as well. But this should be enough to get you going.